Alan Moore promised me the most obnoxious cat in the world, and instead he gave me Aleister Crowley for one chapter? I guess we have to talk. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books, and not just any books, but one book in particular, and that is The Great When by Alan Moore, which came out last week, 2 weeks ago, at the beginning of the month. It's the first part of the Long London Quintet, which means 5 books. And I'm going to talk about it in the usual way, which means I'll give you a quick synopsis, what it is, what to expect, why you should go and read it. Then I'll drink some beer. You go and read the book, which you should. And then we talk about some themes and stuff that may entail, well, that will entail spoilers, I think. So be forewarned. I'll let you know when that happens. Otherwise, you can always stick around and don't care about spoilers that much. I mean, it's a historical novel. You kind of know where Britain ends up anyway, don't you? And with that said, let's get started, shall we? All right. The Great When, first part of the Long London Quintet, which is incredibly hard to say, takes place in 1949 in London. Big surprise. So it is a historical novel, sort of. It is also magical realism, I guess, in some way, shape, or form, in that it does blend the magical or the surreal and surrealist with the historical. It does end more or less without a big cliffhanger beyond, the epilogue. So it is the first part of a series, so there will be more stuff revealed, but it is a fairly closed off story. So you can certainly read this and don't necessarily need to go into the next book immediately. So yeah, that's the first part. It is Alan Moore writing, so we need to talk about those kind of aspects of it. It is the story mostly of one Dennis Knuckleyard, who is 18, I guess, and works in a secondhand bookstore and tracks down a book that comes with all kinds of troubles. And the rest of the book is mostly about him navigating London and parts of London that he may have never heard about before and may have doubted exist before, meeting different kind of people, forming attachments, getting schooled about why those attachments might be bad ideas, and generally just trying to survive and holding on while London is slowly leaving the 1940s, which, you may have noticed or remember from history, were not the best kind of decade for London. And that is very much the atmosphere that hovers over this, a Britain recovering from World War II, from the Blitz and the bombings and all of that stuff, and slowly trying to figure out what's it going to be now that war is over and possibly the Empire is also ending. Beyond that, you have a very classic sort of like adventure story, very pulpy in some regards, lots of action, lots of stuff happening, Dennis being a bit of a not the sharpest knife in the drawer, to put it mildly, and generally all of that. The prose is very postmodern, very meandering, and uses a large vocabulary of stuff that you may not have read in a long time, that you may feel like you need looking up in case you don't necessarily read too much occult literature and are heavily into alliterations and onomatopoeia. That's the point. So be forewarned for that. It can be a bit of a sort of like obscure reading experience in that regard. If you've read your China Miévilles or your Brian Catlings, you'll be all right, I guess. But it does have that vibe to it, and I think that is probably the one warning I have to give out here. If you don't vibe with that kind of prose, and I know that it's, in some older Alan Moore prose as well. So if you don't vibe with that kind of prose, you'll have a hard time. If you're fine with that style, with that sort of like way of creating sentences, this is really good. This is really interesting, and it fits seamlessly into a larger series of books or number of books that have recently come out or are still coming out that all sort of look at Britain and what is going on. So if you like an adventure story with lots of weird shit going on in London in the 1940s with obscure and very emotional swear words and don't fear the kind of language that you can expect from someone like Alan Moore, go read it. I think it's worth reading. I think it's a really interesting book. I'm very much looking forward to the next parts of the series. I hope they won't take forever. But until then, I'll let you read the book, have some beer, and then we'll talk about what it all means, or what I think it may mean, and so forth. So go read it. It's not that long. All right. Since you're back, I assume you've read the book, or you really, really don't care about spoilers. So let's get started with the things that I want to talk about. So I want to start first with situating it in sort of this, what I already hinted at, this larger sort of like series or number of books that I think is currently being published that all sort of deal with what you might call the matter of Britain, so to speak. And then I'll talk about occultism, fiction, and stuff like that, and then talk about the grotesque, and then we'll see where all of this ends. Let's start with the first part. Britain is fucked. The UK is fucked. We all know that. Most British people, I guess, also know that, and even the recent elections of Labour don't necessarily change that much about it, as far as I know. But there's a lot of people trying to figure out what went wrong and when it went wrong with Britain. And that's what I think is, what also drives this specific book, this being The Great Win. Other books in that sort of like ballpark, I think, I haven't read it yet, is The Sunken Land Begins to Rise Again by M. John Harrison. I'm really going to read that very soon. I'm excited about it. It sounds like a great premise. There's other books that also look at that. For example, Gog Magog and probably Ludluda, which is coming out later this year by Jeff Noon and Steve Beard, kind of falls sort of in the same direction, even though it is much more fantastic. And I'll definitely talk about those books once I have, actually read the second part as well, which is somewhere in December. There's more stuff like that. China Medieval, as I said, kind of comes into that as well. Other authors definitely also look at this, try to figure out what went wrong and when it went wrong with Britain, trying to analyze what the soul of a nation. And Britain is interesting in that regard, because you have a country that was, a huge imperial dickhead in the 19th and early 20th century, had a gigantic role, and one that is generally celebrated during World War II, when it, helped fight Nazis, which is always a good thing, remember that. But kind of after that, sort of lost its way in a lot of ways, kind of struggled through imperial decline, then the Maggie Thatcher era, which we really don't want to get too much into, and is still trying to figure out what's going on. Brexit being one of the recent big hiccups that are all kind of tied all into that. So trying to figure out what went wrong with Britain and when it went wrong, I think, is something that a lot of authors that live in the UK kind of try to do, understandably, because exploring sort of like the soul of your homeland, of your home, I guess, is part of what being an author is. That's what art is for, trying to sort of tap into that larger subconscious, that spirit, or whatever you want to call it. And I would argue that The Great Wen very much fits into that. And the idea of having the Long London Quintet being, 5 books, each set in the next decade, so the next one will be set in the late 50s, I assume, and so forth, I think is sort of Moore's attempt of tracking British history through 50 years, I guess, to try and figure out what went wrong all the way to the millennium, I guess. That is the first part that I wanted to talk about. Now, the question is, how do you do that? What are the sources you're looking at? And obviously, the big thing here is psychogeography, something that other authors, like, once again, M. John Harrison, have dealt with before and are looking at. There's all kinds of other authors that do psychogeography stuff as well. So, yeah, using that, I think, is an important part, because Britain is very much defined, or at least London is sort of like one of these weird cities that have so many layers and so much importance globally, and ideas that we all have in our heads when we talk about Britain or when we talk about London. We all have like ideas of London, and trying to see how those sort of connect or build up the larger sort of like British experience, I think, is a clever approach. Now, Alan Moore, being Alan Moore, obviously goes somewhere else, and that I think is also important here, and that is occultism. We all know that Alan Moore is a bit of an occultist and practicing magician in a lot of ways. The Big Bumper Book of Magic also came out right now. I haven't read that. Maybe I'll find a way of reading it at some point. It sounds certainly interesting. So looking at occultism, I think, makes sense for him. I think there's another larger aspect to that, and that's where I want to turn now. So once again, this is occultism, and then we'll talk about fiction. Britain obviously had a very strong occult tradition in the 19th and 20th century. The Order of the Golden Dawn was founded there. Aleister Crowley, who is, one of the people meeting in the first opening scenes of the what you might call the prologue, I guess. Meeting with Dion Fortune, who is another big, well, more like a theosophist, occultist of the 19th century. Helena Blavatsky lived in London for a while. Britain has always been occult, or had an interest in occultism. I'm pretty sure in the next book we'll also talk about Gardner and the rise of Wicca. I'm pretty sure that will happen. So having all of these ideas and tying the sort of like occultist element into the book makes a lot of sense. I think there's a second bigger part though that I think is important. There's an afterword to the book where Moore talks about fiction and history and how the two, like myth and fiction and history, often intermingle in a lot of ways, and I think that is sort of where we end up with this, because occultism, or doing magic in a lot of ways, is like writing fiction. It's trying to write fiction that then influences reality. That's how you do a lot of magic in a lot of ways, right? You create a fiction and want the world to sort of bend towards the fiction that you have created for yourself, the narrative that you have created for yourself and the world. So using fiction and magic and then occultism in this way, I think, is a very clever way. A very clever approach to looking at the British soul, because it is very much tied to that. It's very much about the stories that a nation tells itself about itself, and trying to make reality, approach those stories that we tell ourselves. And that's obviously something that every nation does. Every country does that when it comes to like national identities. You just look at the US and the ideas, like the narratives that are there about, freedom and all of these wonderful things, and trying to make the world sort of accept those fictions, which is exactly how magic works in that regard. So that's the first part. The other part, I think, is and that's where the whole idea of the Great Wen kind of tries, sort of the Long London sort of taps into that, because, what we learn is that London, that form of London, is basically made up out of all these archetypes, all these ideas, all these fictions that other people have created about London in the past and in the present, and it's slowly shifting, and you can probably impact it in some way or form, and maybe even change those ideas if you can manage to, you do magic and change the narratives of the things that people believe about London, believe about the world, become part of these like larger archetypes, and you can tap into that. I think that's one of the interesting approaches to fiction and occultism that Moore uses here. And this is where the stuff gets funny, is, of course, by writing this book about London in this specific way, Alan Moore is doing magic, because he is, in his way, once again, telling a story about London that will hopefully change our ideas about London, and then those ideas will then impact sort of that larger global, or whatever you want to call it, subconscious or image gestalt about London in the background. And I think that's a very clever way of doing stuff, the idea of using art, because this is obviously art, using art to influence the world and change the world is a long and a tried and tested method, which is obviously why we need to talk about surrealism and possibly about the Situationists, because I always want to talk about the Situationists, because that's the next part here. There is surrealism here. In fact, one of the more important characters, and a historical character that is mixed into all of this, next to the occultists like Crowley and Dion Fortune, and then later Ken Grant, who is sort of calls himself for a while Crowley's successor. Beyond that, we obviously have what's his name, Austin Spare, who was a surrealist painter and part of the Surrealism movement. And if you know anything about Surrealism, you know that that was originally, well, it was an art collective, but it was also like a very political art collective that tried to change the world through art. So using that and having that element in here makes sense, and that also explains why the Long London feels very much like Surrealism in a lot of ways. And this is kind of interesting, like Surrealism in a lot of ways tried to tap into the subconscious, which is why you have like stuff like automatic writing and creating exquisite corpses, paint, the whole like you draw a part of a painting, you fold it over, the next person paint something underneath and so forth. Tapping the subconscious is very much what Surrealism in a lot of ways was about. So using Surrealist imagery here makes a lot of sense, which is one of the things where like China Miéville kind of comes in when you read something like The Last Days of New Paris, which is all about Surrealism in Paris in the 1940s. So there is that parallel here. I think Moore handles things more deftly. He tells a much more interesting story and has a level of like wry humor that The Last Days of New Paris didn't have. In that regard, it feels more like, if you want to compare it to China Miéville, some more is, of course, more like Kraken in that regard. Obviously, Kraken also is, takes place in London with its weird occult underground, so those parallels make a lot of sense. And Moore's prose style, using a lot of obscure words, trying to play with the sounds of words and so forth, is in some regards similar to China Miéville in that regard. So using that, I think, is interesting. Another part, and I feel that's also interesting here, is the connection to Arthur Machen. Now, obviously, I love Arthur Machen in a lot of ways. He's an interesting writer, hugely influential on a lot of different writers over the years. William Blake also kind of comes up here in some elements later on, but Machen in particular makes a lot of sense because Machen influenced people like H.P. Lovecraft, and you have Lovecraft using stuff like the Dreamlands, which is also once again his sort of conception of the subconscious. Some Jungian ideas kind of flow into that as well. So using Machen and his story and about this larger world behind does tie once again into this idea of trying to tap the subconscious, which can be, artistically useful and powerful, but there's always a level of danger, and that I think is the other part here. Alan Moore is doing magic, or what you might call magic, probably with a K at the back, doing magic here by writing a book about the subconscious ideas of London and trying to change them. But he's also warning the reader about the dangers that are tied to that. This is dangerous stuff. This is politics. This is art. This is, in a way, I would almost call this is activism in a way, in a very abstract sort of artistic way. The same way that the Surrealists and later Situationist International used art to try and change our perception of the world and thus change the world. And tying it to Machen's more like cosmic horror adjacent ideas, and the way that Machen then obviously influenced people like Lovecraft and their ideas of cosmic horror, and a lot of the darker stuff that is tied into Lovecraft, and also frankly to Machen there's a lot of highly problematic depictions of all kinds of stuff in Arthur Machen as well. So having that in there, I think, makes a lot of sense, which brings me to the next part that I wanted to talk about, and that is the grotesque. Because in a lot of ways, this is also a grotesque book. And I think that once again makes sense. On the one hand, the imagery in this book, when Dennis enters the Long London, you have the way it is described, is on the one hand surrealist, but it's also very much grotesque with all kinds of pieces being animated, newspapers being animated, but also drain pipes turning into snakes and eating people and shit like that. It is grotesque. It is the kind of stuff that could give you nightmares if you're not careful. And that, I think, is important, because the other part about the subconscious is you don't necessarily want to go in there, because there's the sleep of reason does produce monsters, and going to search in the subconscious in the Long London will actually lead to you confronting these monsters in a lot of ways. And beyond just using, language to describe obscure and occult and grotesque monstrosities, what Moore does, and this I think is where the language is important. He uses grotesque language, the way he forms sentences, and sometimes he uses very archaic terms, long sentences that meander around, coil in on themselves, and so forth. The language used in itself is grotesque, which does add to this feeling of the grotesque by when you look at just the things that he describes. The way he describes them is also grotesque, which is very much where I would say you can see the parallel to Brian Catling and his books like The Vor. There's some parts set in London that certainly ring a bell here, and coincidentally also include William Blake, which, makes sense, or his much shorter Hollow. So where you also have these ideas of like using very grotesque language, and having that spill over into the things that this language describes, the images that you paint with that language. And I think that is the second important part here. Because once again, this is very dangerous shit. And on the one hand, clearly calling it dangerous is part of creating that image of mystery, that air of mystery that is so important about doing magic in the one hand. But it's also a bit of a warning, because there is a truth to that, and we see that in obviously the main story with with Clive at the end being incredibly delighted by coming into this absolute nightmare country that is Long London, going like, well, it's all so fun and it's so great and so brilliant. It's like, yeah, that's a mind with all the brakes off, and that's exactly what you shouldn't have. You should be scared of this shit. You should be afraid of what you're doing when you're playing with those very sort of like protean forces that are our imagination and are our thoughts. And this, I think, is the second big important part. Now let's try and tie this all together with the plot and end it all. I think this, at its core, is a story about imagination, the power of fantasy, the power of imagination, and the stories we tell ourselves, and a warning at the same time. We need storytelling, we need imagination to change the world, to make the world a better place. We need to find out what we want the world to be and tell us that kind of story. But it is very possible to, and very easy to, tell ourselves the wrong stories with terrible, results, which is on the one hand what we see with Dennis and Grace. And Dennis, obviously, like, props to Alan Moore, how he does that at the end, realizing that, Grace is a child prostitute. Dennis does, at the end of the day, well, she tells him don't, and he accepts it and understands that up to a point. And that, once again, is also based on the stories that he tells himself about himself and Grace, and realizing that those are dangerous stories. Those are the kind of stories we need to be careful about. A different one is, of course, the inferred, what's it called? The inferred Saracen, which is very much about not the archetype of a person of color, but the archetype of what white people think a person of color is. And that, that's once again about the power of stories and how that can, in fact, change the world very much to the worse. So, while this is not telling us the story of the Britain that should be, this is very much telling us the story of how Britain turned into the place that it is right now. Obviously, there is a call to action there, which means go and imagine a better world, imagine a better Britain, try ways of bringing that, manifesting that into reality by art. But so far, we're just exploring how we ended up where we ended up. And that, I think, is a worthy undertaking. Wow, my words. Is very much a worthy undertaking. And I applaud him, Alan Moore, for that. I absolutely enjoyed it. I love the very sort of like dry, ironic way of doing it. I love the introduction with Alistair Crowley and Dion Fortune, then switching into the Battle of Cable Street. And these are all sort of like bits and pieces of the Britain that was, and the Britain that could have been, Britain, the Battle of Cable Street, a lot of people banding together to beat up Mosley and his fucking Nazis and his fascists. We could have had a better Britain if we kind of stuck to that specific sort of like origin and built a story from there. There's other options there, and I think that's, at the end of the day, where I want to end this. This is a story about the power of stories, giving us the tools to tell ourselves better stories by exploring how the ones we told ourselves led to a pretty fucked up place at the moment. And Alan Moore's definitely the kind of person to tell us that specific story. I enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed it. If you enjoyed it, let me know in the comments. If you didn't enjoy it, also let me know in the comments. If you agree with me, let me know in the comments. If you disagree with me, also let me know in the comments. And use all caps. I think that helps, right? Anyway, thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, share this if you feel like it. Possibly join the Patreon if you really want to help me out. Otherwise, I'll see you very soon when I talk about something else. And until then, I don't know. Cheers.